Michael Grayson couldn't remember the exact moment when Sarah's words of love forever lost their sincerity. He stood by the window in his Seattle living room holding the envelope containing the DNA test results. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest, while memories of their life together played on a loop in his mind. Outside, the morning light was unusually bright for Seattle, illuminating the empty silence in the house. Maybe it was the cold or his own inner trembling, but he kept clenching and unclenching his hands as if trying to shake off the crushing realization. Sarah had already left for work. Usually on Mondays she stayed home a bit longer, sipping coffee with him on the veranda. But everything had changed today. He found himself wondering when her gaze, once so peaceful, had turned into a veil of tension hiding something deep. She was gone in a hurry, leaving behind the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee and a hint of floral perfume. It struck him that her customary morning smile had become a mask, one he didn't recognize. Just a few months earlier he hadn't suspected a thing. Sarah was a caring mother and a driven professional. He was confident in their strong marriage, even if the occasional busy schedule made them miss each other. But then a whisper of doubt nudged him to notice small signs, unusual destinations in her Google Maps history, late returns from work, and random slips of paper from a bus route she supposedly never used. At first, Michael dismissed these as coincidences. But then he acted on the nagging suspicion and did a paternity test. The results arrived on a typically rainy Seattle day, a thin, almost weightless envelope whose contents bore more gravity than anything he had ever held. "Paternity is not confirmed," stated the cold, clinical text. There were no tears or screams, just a suffocating stillness in his heart. Whenever he closed his eyes, he heard only his own ragged breath and the erratic rhythm of his heartbeat. From then on, he couldn't look at Sarah without recalling the test results. He remembered how she used to say, "I love you," and how deeply he had believed in those words. Now a bitter thought gnawed at him. That same phrase was being said to someone else. The final puzzle piece fell into place when he discovered the name David Connor, a bus driver who had once seemed like a friendly acquaintance, a casual presence he'd even chatted with. It felt like the worst betrayal imaginable, especially when he realized this man was, in all likelihood, the father of the boy he'd raised and cherished as his own. Michael found himself filled with a rage he barely recognized. Yet he refused to make a scene. Instead, he decided to bring down Sarah's life and David's by stealth and calculation. An almost terrifying clarity seized him. There would be no shouting or insults. He would simply ensure that both of them felt the consequences of their actions in every aspect, financially, socially, personally. He was ready to block every route to their happiness, just as he felt they had robbed him of his peace. Looking over the table that held the DNA test, he realized how clinical and unemotional the paper seemed while a storm raged inside him. He pictured her, bustling each morning, glancing at her phone, stepping out to meet a man who was supposed to be just a casual friend. He felt the sting of mockery in what they had done. As he clenched his fists, he also thought about the innocent boy who knew only one dad, him. The conflict tore at Michael's core, fueling the thirst for retribution. Without saying anything to Sarah, he methodically set his plan in motion. On the day he confronted her, it all began with a single question: "Do you know a man named David Connor?" She tried to evade him, fear flickering in her eyes. He pushed harder, and eventually she admitted that something had happened once, or maybe twice, she claimed. She had concealed it, terrified of losing everything. Michael's voice trembled with anger as he asked when. She looked away, her silence cutting deeper than any confession of guilt. She had hoped the baby would be Michael's, that their marriage would remain intact. But the facts were undeniable now. Overwhelmed, Michael stormed out, consumed by betrayal, yet with no appetite for public drama. Instead, he resolved to set the wheels of a cold vengeance in motion, using his background in finance and his business connections. The plan was to gain leverage over David's small share in a local transportation company and corner him financially. If Sarah had chosen this man over him, he would make sure David paid dearly. And as for Sarah, he'd find a way to punish her through legal procedures, property claims, and anything else that might force her to face the gravity of her betrayal. In the next few days, Michael searched for any information linking David to the transport depot Sarah's phone had guided him to. He spent hours online, studied driver rosters, and recognized David's face on a social media page. The evidence was damning: photos, comments, even one of Sarah's casual likes on David's post from an Italian restaurant they both seemed to have visited at the same time. That single clue was enough to unleash dark thoughts he'd never harbored before. He decided to confront David in person and drove out to the depot on a dreary Seattle afternoon. Rain drizzled steadily, blending with the roar of bus engines and the clamor of people on shift changes. Michael felt an uneasy mixture of moral outrage and raw jealousy. When he finally found David and introduced himself as a potential investor in the company, David appeared relaxed, almost friendly. In that moment, Michael saw firsthand the nonchalant attitude that had likely captivated Sarah. David had that easy confidence, someone who never seemed weighed down by regrets or consequences. It infuriated Michael to know that this man might be the real father of the child he had rocked to sleep and taught how to hold a fork. After a superficial chat about the transport business and possible investments, Michael left, hands trembling. David had no idea who he really was. But Michael now had a face and a personality to target. He gripped the steering wheel, trying to calm down enough to drive. His plan needed to be precise, devastating, and irreversible. That night, Sarah waited in the living room. He found her perched on the sofa with her knees drawn up, the same hollow gaze he'd seen when first discovering the truth. She started to speak, but Michael cut her off with a simple question about David Connor. When she admitted she'd been with him, even if it was just a few brief encounters, it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. She claimed she didn't tell David about the baby's paternity. She'd hoped everything would turn out fine. Michael's bitterness only grew, thinking of the child he'd loved so completely. He demanded to know if David planned on fatherhood. Sarah tearfully insisted that David wasn't the kind of man to embrace responsibility. In the days that followed, Michael escalated his revenge plan. He hired lawyers and arranged to meet with a well-recommended attorney, Linda Rains, explaining the DNA test result and his intention to file for divorce. Linda told him that if he legally contested paternity, it might mean giving up fatherly rights if the real father stepped in. In a moment of painful clarity, Michael realized his love for the boy went beyond biology, even though betrayal had shattered his marriage. Yet, outraged and hurt, he pressed on. Simultaneously, he reached out to a broker friend, Jack, to inquire about purchasing a controlling interest in the transport company employing David. The idea was to squeeze David's financial resources until he lost everything, his job, his livelihood, maybe even forcing him to leave Seattle. Michael felt a grim satisfaction at the thought. But the logistics of orchestrating such a downfall were complicated. Business didn't revolve around his personal heartbreak, and there were no guarantees that his investment plan would bring David to ruin. Meanwhile, Sarah was spiraling in her own panic. The house that once felt secure turned cold. Michael avoided her every chance he got, locking himself in his office or staying out late. She pleaded for a conversation about their son, who was starting to sense that both parents were miserable and distant. Michael simply told her he had nothing to say yet and that she could deal with David if she wanted. At times, she tried to justify her mistakes, that she'd felt lonely, unappreciated, and David had showed up with words and gestures that momentarily filled the void. But she couldn't absolve herself, nor could she coax any forgiveness out of her husband. The child, feeling the tension, would ask Sarah why Daddy no longer read him bedtime stories. Each time, guilt stabbed deeper into her heart. She realized she had inflicted this pain on everyone. She even consulted her own lawyer, who explained that if Michael pursued legal action, the outcome could leave Sarah facing financial hardship and could question custody issues. She left the lawyer's office trembling, haunted by the possibility of losing both her marriage and stability for her son. One evening, while grocery shopping, Michael unexpectedly ran into David, who was with another woman, casually joking with her about dinner plans. Seeing David's carefree, laid-back demeanor was like an open wound for Michael. His anger flared at the realization that David not only had an affair with Sarah but also seemed to have a new love interest. How many other women were there? How had Sarah ever allowed this man to become so deeply entangled in their lives? David recognized him from their previous investment chat. He greeted Michael politely, unaware of the storm inside him. The woman, named Kathy, even suggested they meet for coffee sometime and discuss business opportunities together. Michael wanted to lash out, to scream that David was a fraud who'd ruined a family, but instead he forced a polite smile, saying maybe they would meet another time. Back in the car, his hands shook so violently he had to sit motionless for several minutes, rain drumming against the windshield. He hated the thought that David could carry on as though nothing had happened while Michael's own life lay in ruins. Yet Michael's scheme to buy into the transport company stalled. Even though he managed to acquire some shares, making him a partial influencer in corporate decisions, it turned out that David had a small stake as well, one he risked losing if he failed to pay certain capital fees. Michael hoped David wouldn't afford it and would be forced out, but a mysterious private investor saved David at the last minute, covering the payment. Michael stormed out of Jack's office in rage. It felt like fate was mocking him. How, after all this, did David manage to keep his financial footing? That evening, Sarah intercepted Michael in the hallway asking for a conversation about their boy. She said the child was confused and needed a father's reassuring presence. Michael retorted bitterly that she should arrange it with her friend, David Connor. Sarah burst into tears and ran off, slamming her bedroom door. Michael stood alone, trembling from the intensity of his rage and sorrow, wondering if there was anything left worth saving. As more time passed, Michael realized that immersing himself in cold revenge was eroding him from within. He wasn't sleeping, nights became a swirl of rage and regret. His child grew distant, looking at him with anxious eyes. Eventually, late one night, Michael had a dream in which the boy cried, reaching for him, calling Daddy, while Michael turned away. Waking up in a sweat, he understood how deeply he loved this child, even if biology said otherwise. In the morning, Michael quietly approached Sarah in the kitchen. She looked startled, not expecting him to speak kindly. He told her he couldn't continue living in this hateful state. They both knew their marriage was beyond repair, but something had to be done for the child's sake. She broke down in tears, nodding and listening, willing to do whatever would help shield their son from further turmoil. Michael renounced his plan to ruin David. He told Sarah he would move forward with the divorce but remain a father figure to the boy. Sarah, trembling, agreed to relinquish any spousal support demands, relieved to see a path where her son could retain the only father he had ever known. And in truth, David wasn't eager to claim paternity once he realized the potential legal complications and long-term commitments. Whatever sporadic desires he had to assert his rights evaporated quickly. Michael and Sarah formalized their divorce. He packed some belongings and moved into a small rented apartment. On his last day in the house, he hugged his son tight, tears stinging his eyes. The boy didn't grasp why Daddy was leaving but clung to him, calling him Dad. Sarah stood nearby, her own tears flowing, understanding too late that she had destroyed the life they once built together. Yet life went on. Over time, Michael visited the boy on weekends, taking him to the park, reading him stories. Though the marriage was over, the father-son bond persisted. Little by little, Michael felt the bitterness recede enough for him to function. Sometimes he caught himself wishing none of this had happened, that Sarah had never had that fleeting, destructive affair. But he also acknowledged that nothing could undo what was done. The legal case concluded quietly. Sarah stayed in her advertising job, Michael continued his consulting work. David, for his part, vanished from their orbit, possibly ashamed or simply wanting to avoid tangling with legalities. Michael reflected on how the affair and the DNA test that shattered his illusions had taught him the fragility of marriage. Though he couldn't forgive easily, he recognized that hatred gained him nothing but despair. Sitting in his new apartment one night, Michael flipped through an old photo album. In the pictures, Sarah was pregnant and glowing with happiness, or they were celebrating the birth of their boy or traveling to the Grand Canyon as a family. Now these memories felt incomplete, marred by the hidden truth. Yet a gentle, melancholic warmth lingered, reminding him that those joyful moments had been real in their own way. He realized he had safeguarded what mattered most, his role in the boy's life. If one day the boy discovered his biological origins, Michael hoped the child would still remember the father who rocked him to sleep, taught him life lessons, and loved him unconditionally. That knowledge, Michael decided, would sustain him as he turned the page on the betrayal and faced a future where "I love you" had taken on a new, more cautious meaning. It was a story about loss, but also about learning how to move forward, wounded yet determined to protect whatever fragments of love he could still preserve.